just so I know, is this, you can, we'll get all of them?
Yeah.
No,
There we go.
just check them over. Yeah.
Oh, actually, I told them that you guys would speak from your seat.
Well, I'm gonna be the only one speaking from here.
Okay.
Yeah, just me. I'll help. So is this live or is this being recorded? What's the situation with this one? Okay, so first I want to apologize to the media and to the public for the delay in this press conference. Truly, we thought it would be delivered much earlier. But to give you a little bit of the backstory, last Friday I had an opportunity to go to the police department, and I spent 5.5 hours interviewing with all of the command staff, talking about the pathway forward. During those conversations, they apprised me of the fact that their interviews were very personal to them. They had expressed their the things that were on their heart and so forth, but they were done with attorney-client privilege. And that was their understanding. And so that they made that point a couple of times to me, and so I knew that, but in the processing of the report, the thought of attorney-client privilege was not to use their name. Okay, but in their mind, it was our interviews will not be printed. Okay, so that was the, let's say, a realization that was came about today. So today, very fortunate that Kenyen Brown, former U.S. Attorney Kenyen Brown, came to deliver his report. Showed up at the office here about 8 o'clock, and as he met in an executive session with the City Council. One of the things that we knew that we wanted to do before we met with the media, and this goes back to the request, another request from the police department, and that request was actually made prior to last Friday to me, saying, "Man, we really would like to, see that report, talk to Mr. Brown, before we read about it or before we see it in the media." And I thought, well, that's a sound request. They said, because this report is about us, and what we want to do is we want to be teed up, to grasp those things in this report that will help us move forward. And we think, in fairness, we should see the report before it becomes public information. So while we were finishing the meetings with the City Council, we had given copies to the executive part of the command staff, and they started reading it, and they realized that the redactions were just of names and not as they had thought. There would be none of their testimony would be because, again, attorney-client privilege. Well, it was at that point in time I recognized that we had to honor what they thought was their attorney-client privilege. When I explained it to Mr. Brown, he said, absolutely. So what we have been doing since that point in time is they have had to go back through the report and redact the personal interviews from all the policemen, but that does not change the recommendations. It doesn't change the body of the report. But some of the things other than just the interviews, it would be very apparent that if you read the reports, you may be able to tie it back to a policeman, okay? And that was what they did not want. And so if there's specific questions about anything other than the direct quotes being redacted, that will come from Mr. Brown, okay? So are there any questions about that? Okay. Again, I thank you for everybody's patience in this, but it was very important that that we try to get this right, and we could not go forward without doing what we've done. So at this time, what I'll do, and I'll move the microphones back over to Mr. Brown, and he will continue on and start his presentation, and he'll introduce his team, and we'll go from there. Called multitasking.
Yes. Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Good afternoon. Good afternoon. It's my pleasure to be here again in the city of Mobile to work on such an important task impacting upon the lives of the hundreds of thousands of Mobilians and the visitors to this great city. I'd like to thank the mayor, the city council, the police department, and the people of Mobile for their insight and time that they spent with us during this interview process, or for the preparation of this report. We were called by the administration in order to conduct a review when, in an 8-month time period or close thereto, there were 6 specific incidents involving the Mobile Police Department's use of force, 4 of which resulted in the use of deadly force against the citizens of Mobile, and particularly of the African American community. All 6 incidents were experienced by members of the African American community. There was a general concern that was expressed to the administration that was also shared by members of the city council that these events were not in isolation but could be perhaps part of a trend due to changing MPD tactics or a non-adherence to MPD policy. So they called me in, and I assembled a team to come in and review those 6 use of force incidents, and you'll hear me talk about those in just a moment, as well as to review MPD policies, procedures, practices, trainings, and everything related to those 6 specific incidents, including the dispatch calls, the reports, the internal affairs reports related to that, the search warrants in the cases where there were search warrants, and to review all of the body-worn camera footage, as well as the officers. Now, I did not interview the officers themselves because of possible litigation by the family members or the survivors of those whose against deadly force was used, but I did review all of the other materials and those who interviewed them. My team is inclusive of myself and previously, of course, the longtime staff member of the United States Senate Ethics Committee, where I performed high-profile investigations in Congress, investigating members of the Senate. Then I was Chief Counsel Staff Director of the House Ethics Committee, where I performed similar high-profile work. To my left is Dr. Tyrone Powers. He is a former Maryland State Trooper, as well as a former FBI Special Agent, and is nationally renowned for his knowledge and expertise in police use of force, and has been called upon many times to give expert testimony both for the defense and the prosecution, both in civil and criminal trials involving police use of force incidents. To my right is Elise Gonzalez, who is a member of the Thompson Coburn Law Firm out of our Dallas office. So I just want to thank them also for participating in this process with me. In terms of the investigation, it was patterned after a Department of Justice pattern and practice investigation, with the exception of we did not do a deep dive into the department's numbers, arrests, the demographics associated with those different numbers. But we did everything else. And so we wanted to emulate as closely as possible the type of investigation that the Department of Justice would have performed had they come to the city of Mobile. We also looked at and compared what police departments under monitorship elsewhere, what the Department of Justice used as their standard, their gold standard of this is what a police department needs to do. Now, from a legal perspective, the individual instances of use of force is a fairly narrow set of circumstances to review. Was there reasonable suspicion that a suspect would cause great bodily injury or death to the officer? Okay, a reasonable suspicion. This is not beyond a reasonable doubt. It's not by preponderance. It's not even really probable cause, but what a reasonable officer would do. And it also has to be force that is proportional to the situation. Okay, so sometimes it would depend on the size of the officer. For example, if there's a 105-pound female officer confronting a situation, her perception of what might cause great bodily harm or injury to her as an officer might be very different than an officer that is a male that's 6'6", 280 pounds. So those are the filters that we use to evaluate the 6 different uses of force that we were tasked with reviewing. But we didn't stop there. We also looked at, okay, if we draw back the lens a little bit and we look beyond those unique set of facts and circumstances, were there choices that the Mobile Police Department could have made leading up to those officers being in that position where they used deadly force appropriately, legally, that could have resulted in an alternative outcome where they did not have to use deadly force. And then we backed up further and said, were there Mobile Police Department policies, procedures, practices, trainings that are available that need to be adjusted so that going forward, the Mobile Police Department can use what's been learned and the best practices and apply that in order to prioritize the sanctity of life. And so that's really our quest, to preserve the sanctity of life upon an examination of these 6 incidents and the Mobile Police Department's policies, procedures, practices, and culture. So with that in mind, I'll kind of take each event in turn, and I'm not going to go into a lot of facts necessarily about each incident. I think most everybody is familiar with those incidents. But I will start with the raid at Sheringham, on Sheringham Drive. This was a raid that was performed pre-dawn, and the Mobile SWAT team was activated. It involved at most a person that they were looking for that had a marijuana conviction, but was known to carry a gun. And the narcotics unit was going to execute the search warrant, and as they executed dynamic entry into the house, meaning that they blew the door open, as 2 officers went down, 2 SWAT team members went down the hallway, in very quick succession, they noticed that there was a laser sight touching their bodies, which was emanating from a firearm. One officer to the left immediately tried to use his gun. The gun jammed. The officer to the right used his firearm and shot the 16-year-old juvenile 4 times, resulting in death. After the shots were fired, they attempted to secure the scene. Once the scene was secured, officers attempted to render medical aid, or did render medical aid to the 16-year-old. So from a purely legal standpoint, the use of force in that instance was justified because the officers reasonably perceived that their lives were in danger, or that they would suffer great bodily injury as a result of that altercation. However, if we back it up and we look, okay, why were MPD officers there? What did they use? We did a review of SWAT team activation and the forms that were used to evaluate what risk a search warrant at that house would precipitate. And they have a weighted system and factors that goes into that. And if you're below a certain standard, SWAT should not be activated. If it's a middle range rating, it's optional to activate the SWAT. If it's at a high level, then it's mandatory that SWAT be activated. In this instance, it was middle range, so SWAT was optional. To the extent that it was optional, there's on this form, there are several questions that relate to officer safety, but there's only one question that arguably relates to a parallel evaluation of whether or not the SWAT activation may cause damage to or injury to the citizens. And it says, are there any elderly, handicapped, or children at the residence. But under this question, in parentheticals, is the phrase, "for informational purposes only." And on this form, where 2 columns where you can mark yes or no, is permanently shaded out. So that left the investigative team with the impression that there was not a genuine evaluation of the risk that the activation of the SWAT, the most aggressive tool in the MPD's toolbox, whether or not there was a genuine evaluation of whether or not the SWAT team considered the possible risk to citizens. That being said, on this one, we also reviewed other documents that showed on this particular occasion it was not done for officer safety, but because there was a shortage of narcotics personnel to execute a search warrant on a house this size. So the most aggressive tool in your toolbox, and you use it because you have a manpower shortage. So we thought that although the use of deadly force was justified, it could have been avoided. If proper consideration had been made, if the MPD had gone to neighbors to determine if there were juveniles in the residence, it could have been, for example, executed during school hours so that juveniles would not be in the home. So we thought, again, while justified, it could be avoidable. The second case that we were asked to review was of another 16-year-old juvenile out at Excel Academy that was caught by a bystander. A very large MPD officer was captured on video arresting a 16-year-old female of rather diminutive size and fully body slamming her with a tactical movement face first. Although the videos do not show that she actually hit her head or hit her face on that occasion. Nonetheless, it caused quite a bit of concern in the community that this might be excessive force given the size of the officer and the size of the 16-year-old female. After reviewing that particular incident, the body-worn camera of the officer we discovered was not turned on when it should have been in order to record just what happened and whether or not she was actually belligerent. So we don't know that for sure prior to her being slammed to the ground. However, based upon the size of the officer, the force at which he used, using that particular technique in order to subdue her, we thought was excessive in that situation, and we opined that within our report. Based upon the size of the officer and the things that he could have done alternatively, such as use firm grips, hold her, and handcuff her, or just wait and let her cool off on that. Within that, I also reviewed the internal video at Excel Academy and observed that prior to that event happening, before the school administrator called the police to get her removed from the campus, the 16-year-old juvenile had a verbal altercation with the school administrator, attempted to walk away from him, and she had long braids, and he yanked her hair and turned her body around 180 degrees. And we note that that in itself is a criminal assault, or could be considered a criminal assault. And certainly it could have contributed to her heightened state of agitation. So that particular event we found to be excessive force. I'm going to stop there. Perhaps, do you have any comments on those two?
No.
Okay. The next case I'll talk about is Mr. Jawan Dallas. You might remember this is the one where the taser was used at the mobile home park. Police received a call that there might be a possible burglary at a particular address. When they got there, the people who called in said, well, we think they've moved down the road a little bit. And so the officers on foot traveled down the road a little bit, and they encountered two individuals. One was behind a fence, and it was encapsulating a particular mobile home, and it was locked. So the officers inquired, how did you get behind the fence? Do you live there? And he said no. And they asked him to hop the fence and provide his identification. He provided his identification. Next, they saw Mr. Dallas in a vehicle. They made inquiry of him to provide his identification. He looked around the vehicle, but did not produce his identification. The officers asked several more times for him to produce the identification. He did not. Ultimately, police opened the door by reaching in and asked him to step out. When he stepped out, he immediately began to run, and the two officers tackled him, and then a pretty good melee between those three individuals ensued, to the point where the person who had called in the original complaint was observing what was happening and said that, hey, you all, MPD, needs to get some more people out here in order to help the officers who are here on the scene. And at one point in the struggle, one of the officers decided to tase Mr. Dallas in order to get him to comply, to stop being combative, to stop hitting them and wrestling with them, resisting arrest. And at one point, Mr. Dallas actually goes for the taser of one of the officers, and there's a struggle for the taser. And at that point, the officer is able to get the taser back, and they are able to tase him a couple more times. But the taser, from their perspective, is completely ineffective, and they actually just throw the taser to the side, and eventually they wrestle with Mr. Dallas and subdue him. Now, during that time, he's placed in handcuffs, he's on the ground, and that use of force in that situation was reasonable based upon a person fleeing and being combative with the police. Now, what follows after that was very troubling in that Mr. Dallas repeatedly asked for medical assistance. The EMS had been called by the police. However, when he requested water, or that the officers pour water on him, that he didn't feel good, that his arm hurt, that he could not breathe, he was told by officers 5 times, shut the F up. And he was in distress, and they were nonetheless creating a circumstance where they could have offered a little bit of more support for him right there. There was an occasion where he was laying on his back with his handcuffs, hands behind him, and he attempted to turn over, and the attending MPD officer who he had just wrestled with said, move again and I'm going to hit you in your MF and stomach. Both of these things are unacceptable. There is a tertiary officer that is kind of dealing with a citizen that is hearing Mr. Dallas's cries and makes an inquiry of the officer about what's going on and that they need to attend to Mr. Dallas. And unfortunately, this officer then gets into a verbal altercation with the bystander and tells him, well, bring your ASS over here and we'll whoop you too. These are all actions that were done by the Mobile police officers on the scene. So while the use of force in the situation was acceptable given the context of a fleeing suspect that they suspect is engaged in a burglary who is combative with them on the scene, how Mr. Dallas was treated after he was in custody is problematic. Now, the EMS, when they got to the scene, and this is county EMS, they didn't immediately look in on Mr. Dallas. And when she initially, or when she did actually talk to Mr. Dallas, she said, "Hey, I'm an EMT. Don't mess with me. Don't fight with me. Don't mess my SHIT stuff up." All very problematic for an individual who is in medical distress requesting medical support. So those instances are very problematic. So we made several recommendations within our report to improve how MPD responds to those type of situations. The next event involves a Mr. Beezer DuBose Jr. This was a stop at a gas station for dark tinted windows. The officer pulled him over, said, "I've pulled you over for dark tinted windows," and he asked for his driver's license. He provides it, and in that circumstance, the officer then asked for his insurance. He said, "Yeah, I've got insurance. Here you go." And then he inquires again, why did you pull me over? And the officer responds, "Well, I told you dark tint." And he says, "Man, you pulled me over last week." He's like, "Why are you really pulling me over?" Then the officer says, "Please step out of the car." Mr. DuBose steps out of the car. He immediately turns him around, places handcuffs on him, and starts to direct him to the patrol car that's parked behind his car that the arresting officer was in. Mr. DuBose, concerned about being arrested, calls out to a bystander. He says, "Hey, call my girl, tell her I've been arrested by the police," and he calls out the number, his telephone number. The officer that was involved says, "Call his mama too," in response to him saying that. He presses him against the police car, and Mr. DuBose moves off the position where the officer wanted him a little bit. And so the officer kind of verbally and physically kind of shoves him back to where he wants him. Mr. Dallas, who is handcuffed at this point, starts to make verbal assaults upon the officer, using profane language, using racial epithets. The officer then takes Mr. DuBose and pushes him towards a post. And while he's pushing him towards the post, he grabs his hair that is in a dreadlock style in order to control his body. He pushes him against the post, but rather than stay at arm's distance from Mr. DuBose, he leans in closely to his face and starts to argue back and forth with him, exchanging verbal insults, exchanging profanity back and forth with him, giving up the superior tactical position. Then the two leave the post as the officer tries to direct him back to the car. And you see in the body-worn cameras that then the officer just starts to hit Mr. DuBose with closed fists to the face several times, and eventually he jumps on his back and forces him to his knees and punches him again with closed fists. Upon close inspection of the video, well, let me put it this way. When the officer gets him subdued and in the car, he then says to fellow officers, "Well, he was grabbing my privates. That's why I was hitting him." And he gives that as a justification for why he was using closed fists, hitting a handcuffed prisoner that's in custody at that point. However, the investigative team did not find that claim to be credible because of several things. One, the officers on the scene who he complained to that the suspect that grabbed his private say, "Well, hey, if he grabbed you, you need to go to medical." The officer did not go to medical on that occasion, but rather waited 3 days after the event had been posted on social media by the bystander. Also, when he was in the car and taking him to the Metro jail, the officer complained several times about his thumb being injured. And he complained to his partner about it. He winced in pain. He tried to massage his thumb so he wouldn't experience any pain. However, he did not complain a single time about any pain in his groin area. And on that 11-minute ride from where they were to the Metro jail, the officer did not complain about the groin area being injured at any time. So we just didn't find his rationale for using a closed fist on a handcuffed suspect as credible. We find instead that the use of force was excessive. We also found that the rationale for getting to that point was unreasonable, and that the officer had unnecessarily escalated the situation by taunting the suspect, using profanity for the suspect, and the fact that when we talked to the training department of MPD, the use of profanity was listed as an exponential escalator of the use of force. The grabbing of hair was not a tactic that was taught by MPD. The officer's lack of arm's length distance from the suspect was also not taught at the training academy of MPD. So there were a number of things that this officer did that escalated the situation beyond what it had to be, and also he did not follow the training, and therefore we did not think that a reasonable officer with his training should have taken the actions that he did. Therefore, we found that there was an excessive use of force. The next to the last incident was Christopher Jones. Christopher Jones was sleeping on a roof, and several neighbors called and said, hey, there's an individual sleeping on the roof. Officers arrived. They took a tree branch. They hit the under part of an awning and asked him to come out. Mr. Jones came out and started a conversation with the officers. They asked him to get down because the neighbors he was scaring the neighbors. And he said, scaring the neighbors? And the officer said, get off the roof, F, immediately using bad language. And he also then unhooked his taser, put his hand on his taser, and he said, Mr. Jones said, you're going to tase me? And the officer said, yeah, if you don't get off the roof, I'm going to tase you. So Mr. Jones immediately recognized that the escalation of use of force was rather rapid. In that situation, Mr. Jones, then concerned about being tased, started to walk back and forth on the roof so that he can jump down where the officers were not. And then there was some additional conversations with the officers where they said that they wouldn't tase him. However, he managed to get back to the back side of the house, jump down, and there was a fence separating the front from the back of the house. And the officer that was still in the front of the house saw that Mr. Jones was reaching into a bag. The officer that was going around to back to confront Mr. Jones and talk to him was headed around, but the officer in front said, hey, he was trying to give warnings to the second officer. When the second officer got around to the back, Mr. Jones leveled the barrel of a gun at him, took a shooter stance. The officer responded by firing several times at him, as well as the officer in the front, using deadly force against Mr. Jones. In the context of whether or not the use of force was appropriate in that circumstance, the officers did perceive reasonably a threat of injury or great bodily harm. So we found that the use of force in that circumstance was justified, and that those officers reasonably perceived that they were in danger. However, as we look back to the greater scope of things, the Mobile Police Department had been called out to that same address a week prior for the same reason related to the same person. However, MPD dispatch did not share those facts with the officers that were responding to the call. Nor did the officers have enough community engagement, even though this was their beat, to be aware that Mr. Jones had mental health issues. And if they had perceived that he had mental health issues, how they handled that situation was exactly the opposite of how MPD training guided them with respect to interacting with mentally ill persons on the scene, such as run, run, you better run, the threat of the use of the taser, the use of profanity, all of which were escalating factors for someone, particularly with mental illness, such as Mr. Jones. So we made recommendations related to that to hopefully improve what MPD dispatch provides to officers responding to a scene, and we also recommended that they augment their training for recognizing mental illness and how to interact with the mentally ill if they're encountered on the job. The last incident involved an individual by the name of Cordell Jones, and this was the execution of a search warrant at 856 Charles Street, early morning again, and the officers got a warrant for the house based upon the allegation of a robbery of another individual of 2 firearms. And the individual that was supposedly involved in that also resided at this 856 Charles Street. As officers approached, they did a dynamic entry into the home, which means they quickly knock on the door, then they blow the door open. There were 15 officers that were involved in this. SWAT was activated in this. Again, the form did not adequately evaluate the possible risk to the citizens because they used the same form that had the for informational purposes only question in the blacked out form. But this one weighted more heavily that required the activation of the SWAT. In particular, one officer was assigned to the back of the house on the left-hand side. Another officer is assigned to the right-hand side. And within 22 seconds of breaching the front door, the officer that is assigned to the back hears a back window open up, and the first thing he sees is the barrel of a gun come out, and then he sees the hand come out, the torso, and an individual. He's probably within 5 feet of the individual, and he shoots the individual after really not giving a warning. He does say, "Hey," but it's not clear that Mr. Jones heard the "hey," and he shoots him 4 times with his handgun, and then once he secures his safety, he does try to offer medical aid to him. The house was not yet secured, so they move him from that position slightly in the backyard to closer to the house, and then eventually down to the closest intersection so that EMT can get to him more quickly. So in this situation, again, the officer gave information to internal affairs in terms of what his thinking was, and that was he was armed with a handgun. Mr. Jones was armed with an automatic weapon. He perceived that rightly that Mr. Jones could have turned, wheeled around to his left, and shot him at close proximity with that automatic weapon. And given the close proximity, probably would have pierced his body armor, causing him death or great bodily injury. He could have turned to his right and perhaps shot the canine officer. And also, since he was fleeing the scene, he was armed. Even though he was naked, he could have gone into the community with the firearm. And under the law, police can use deadly force in that circumstance. So he reasonably perceived the threat of death or great bodily injury either to himself, the canine officer, or unseen other citizens that he could have come into contact with if he had reached the end of the backyard and escaped into the community generally. The law does not require for an officer to wait until a gun is pointed at them before they use deadly force in a circumstance like that. In other words, the officer did not have to give a warning. Giving the warning had the possibility that Mr. Jones could have turned and overpowered him with his weapon and killed him or caused great bodily injury. So in that situation, we formed the opinion that the use of force was justified with Mr. Jones. Now, there are some other facts that relate to this that I should mention, and that is that the family members of Mr. Jones, who were also present, which there were 5 other family members there, were detained appropriately and constitutionally by MPD initially. They moved them down to the intersection as well to have them away from the residence, that's so they don't come back into the house or mess with anything. However, MPD, in our view, improperly and unconstitutionally transported those family members to MPD headquarters, kept them handcuffed, kept them separated from each other, and actually held them longer in time than the duration of the search, which is also unconstitutional. So within this action of searching the house, although the use of force against Mr. Jones was justifiable, it may have been avoidable if the search had been executed at a different time of day. We don't think that MPD prioritized the sanctity of life because of the selection of the time, because the form that they used to evaluate it didn't genuinely evaluate the risk to citizens. And we also found that there were 2 unconstitutional acts that took place with the transport and detention of the family members to MPD headquarters, including a 6-year-old girl. And there was questioning of those individuals. Now, if you have probable cause that the individuals you're transporting have committed a crime, then it would be constitutional. But they did not articulate probable cause in any of the reports that we reviewed. And in fact, when they were at MPD, they only asked them about the dynamic entry into the home that morning. Didn't ask about any other criminal activity except for the individual that was suspected of being involved in the earlier robbery, which was the origin of the search warrant. So we found those situations to be problematic towards the end of that. We also discovered that there was a public sentiment that police, MPD, tried to generally demonize the suspects against which they used lethal force. And this was arguably validated when we discovered that there were requests from MPD officers to do a forensic search on phones of the victims that they had to use deadly force against, specifically the 16-year-old that I mentioned earlier. There were requests to do a forensic search on these phones, but there was no constitutional basis to gather that information from those phones. And it was alleged that the information was being sought so that when MPD officers held a press conference, they could allege facts that they gathered from the phone that may indicate that the individual that they used deadly force against may have been gang affiliated or a drug dealer. So those facts were very troubling. Again, a constitutional violation that we observed during our investigation. that we have made recommendations to MPD to address. Generally speaking, as we held our public forum, one of the biggest, some of the biggest concerns that we heard were excessive force and tone and use of bad language. And talking to trainers at the Mobile Training Academy, they said that the use of profane language is not taught, and it is an escalator on the use of force. MPD regulations specifically prohibit the disrespect, the mistreatment of citizens, or the use of profane language. Yet and still, we noticed this as a theme in all of the incidents that we reviewed, that the use of profane language was acceptable with MPD, and that a culture of contempt of the community developed as a result of that contempt for the community, and that evidenced itself in different ways in different cases. You know, and for example, one, when talking with a member of MPD about the Mr. Dallas situation, the comment was made, well, he was a piece of SHIT. And to the extent that there is not a reverence for life and a prioritization of life, our view is that the contemptuous culture at MPD for the community needed to be remedied. And so we made several recommendations along those lines. I'm going to ask my colleague, Mr. Powers, if I perhaps left anything out.
No, thank you. Did good. Take the questions. Thank you.
Okay, so I'll take your questions now.
So, is your conclusion based on all this that these are rogue officers who are not following policy, or is there a problem with the top-down leadership of the department that you know has created this culture?
You know, a ship's captain always steers the ship. So there might be some instances that might have been rogue, but the culture of MPD we found to be very permissive of the use of profanity. For example, to say to a suspect, well, hey, get out of the car. And then there's no compliance, get out of the effing car. Or to use profanity up to the point of someone being in handcuffs, but then to stop after they're in handcuffs. And so there was not clear messaging that the use of profanity, as outlined in MPD regulations and training, was unacceptable. And so that then bred a culture of the use of profanity, which then led to instances where there was an escalation of the use of force.
Do you have a timetable of when things started getting out of control? Was this something fairly recent, or is this a culture that's been long built into the Mobile Police Department?
So I can't say that for sure. What we do know is that we had 6 incidents in a relatively short period of time, a little bit over 8 months. And that is unusual as these type of matters go on a national scale when you start looking at them. I think the culture took some time to percolate, for it to come down to the individual officers, but the exact amount of time, I can't say for sure.
And you mentioned the Cordell Jones case. The officers knocked down the door quickly after they knocked on it originally. In those knock and announce cases, is there a recommended or required time that officers have to wait after knocking on the door to at least give people an option to come and answer the doors?
That's a great question. The answer is no. And I imagine it's a part of general police tactics in a situation on whether or not you should do that. And whether or not, again, a SWAT team should be activated for a marijuana-related case, for example. is that an appropriate tool to use in that type of situation, and then use it early in the morning? Justifiable, again, but avoidable.
And some of what you had said somewhat contradicts what we've been told, in the media, either on the scene. I know a lot of things can change after an investigation gets going, but did you offer any recommendations to MPD based on communications with the media and the public?
Based upon communications with
Did you offer MPD any recommendations on how they should go about communicating with the media and the public as well?
We did. In terms of their press conferences, we recommended that they not denigrate suspects at press conferences, and particularly those who they've had to use lethal force against in the line of duty. So our recommendations that there be transparency, talk about the facts rather than the character of the person.
In terms of transparency and facts, it's been the longstanding policy of this department not to release any police body camera footage to the public and see. Do you have any recommendations for the public being able to see this?
Well, what we did recommend is that there be a more robust review of body-worn cameras by supervisors of the video, to make sure that there is compliance with MPD policy, to make sure that they don't have the rogue officers. We've also asked them to heighten the penalties that are there for the use of profane language, so that that culture is not acceptable within MPD. And I thought you were going to ask a slightly different question, and this escapes my mind right now, but we can come back to it. Okay.
You mentioned securing a cell phone, going through it in order to prepare for press conferences. Is that accurate?
There are portions of the report that have been redacted, but that is something that we observed. And I don't want to get into specific facts, but I will say that MPD officers are good officers. Many came forward with the problems that they observed within the department. In any organization, there's room for improvement, but certainly an officer made us aware of a circumstance where there were repeated requests to get forensic examination of phones done where there was not a proper constitutional basis or consent to do a search of those cell phones.
So when some of these constitutional questions have come out in this report, will those be recommended that they be further reviewed by other agencies?
I don't know that that's necessarily necessary if MPD has conducted a study like this one, which is robust and comprehensive. As you can see, it's nearly 100 pages in length. But I think it's important that MPD have the ability and demonstrate the ability to be introspective, to review their policy, to be more transparent. I know what I was thinking of, Brandon. It's whether or not the general orders, the memorandum orders, are made public so that the public can actually review the guidelines that the police are guided by. So one of our recommendations is that they make their orders that they operate by reviewable by the public. So the opportunity for the public is there to kind of compare their conduct to what the standards are that they're supposed to live by.
Mr. Brown, can you make the clarification, though, that the cyber unit did not do anything that was unconstitutional?
That's right.
That's the reason that we have a separation, is that even though a request may have been made, it was not granted.
That's correct. So, yes, I want to say the request for the unconstitutional search of the phones was not granted. And those requests were refused by MPD officers.
So one thing that I noticed has been brought up is preconceived notions, and that the officers may have had preconceived notions that basically everybody that they come in contact with armed. Was that systemic throughout the whole department, or was that a couple of officers? Can you elaborate more?
Again, somewhat limited by the redactions that were made, but to answer your question, yes. We did also see that was in several instances and in several reports that we reviewed, that there appeared to be a presumption that everybody had guns, that everyone that they were stopping were gang affiliated or a convicted felon. And it tended to be in minority areas where this was done. And so it tended less to be about intelligence-driven stops, but rather based upon subjective factors that the now defunct street enforcement team was using to stop individuals, rather than intelligence that may have been gathered beforehand that would tend to indicate a greater likelihood that someone is a gang member or someone is involved in the drug trade. It tended to be more recently based upon an officer's subjective thoughts about the type of car that's driving, dark tinted windows, certain neighborhoods. So this was also problematic.
Just to tail off that question, Kenyon, are you saying that some of these inappropriate encounters that happen with people in the community and these officers were race-driven?
Well, certainly the incidences or touches by law enforcement from our observation of the events we reviewed tended to be in African American communities. For example, stopping someone for dark tinted windows, we didn't observe a lot of that in West Mobile, but it tended to be in areas where there was a concentration of minority community members.
And we just,
But again, I want to emphasize we did not do a numbers dive, so I can't say that for sure. But from the information that we saw, it appeared to indicate that.
and we had just listened to you give us a description of what happened in those body camera videos in pretty good detail. Why is it important that the public sees that? Especially since we're all taxpayers.
Well, I think the MPD's rationale and reasoning for that is certainly that there could be possible evaluation of criminal liability for the officer who may have had to use deadly force. And before there's a grand jury determination about whether there's criminal liability, those should not be shared with the public. We don't take issue with that. We think that's appropriate. Whether or not they decide to make that public is up to the police department. Now, I should say there are things that I've articulated that are standards, the Graham versus Connor, that kind of set the constitutional minimum. Courts have said that police departments can set standards higher than constitutional minimum without creating additional liability for the city. In other words, if someone doesn't live up to the higher standard, you can't be sued for setting standards that are higher. Generally, police departments are encouraged across the country to set greater than constitutional standards in their policies and practices.
Can Mobilians right now trust this police department to investigate itself or its own officers?
I think some work needs to be done on that. I had some concerns about some of the practices, such as separating officers involved in a officer-involved shooting. I was advised that there's an unofficial policy that the officers that are involved be separated on the scene. But I did not see any consistency in that rule being applied in order to preserve the integrity of internal affairs investigation.
Like they do witnesses in a crime.
Correct, correct. So I had some concerns there. I had some concerns about some of the practices of internal affairs and how they went about their investigations, and not having a standard list of the items they should gather or the things that they should look at as part of their evaluation in order to judge whether or not a reasonable officer would do that based upon his training here in Mobile.
I guess then that boils back to the question again, how long might this procedure be going on? Is this something that has been inherited from chief to chief to chief? Is this a recent development? I think that applies here.
So if we're talking about standards, a lot of MPD's policies are outdated. I think a lot of them are from the 2011 to 2012 timeframe and back. I'm sorry, 2014 timeframe and back. You know, for example, the description of the duty to intervene in the wake of George Floyd. While there's a specific mention of it, there is not a breakdown of exactly what steps an officer should take to intervene in a situation like that. There has not been a culture developed to incentivize or emphasize the duty to intervene if an officer is engaging in unconstitutional conduct. So that is problematic. And so we made several recommendations that you've seen in the report that address that, and also the recommendation that the public be engaged in that process in terms of adopting rules not only that serve law enforcement needs, but are acceptable to the community, and that prioritize the sanctity of life.
Do you have any specific opinion as to the current chief, Paul Prime's supervision and handling of the police department? He was the chief even through this era.
Things that were clearly articulated in MPD policy and training, I would say Chief Prine did not have an exact articulation of those policies and practices when we interviewed him, and he would articulate policy in a way that was not written. And I think that's problematic. If you aren't following what's provided in training, if you aren't following what's the written policy, and you're following a policy that no one is completely sure of based upon the fact that it's in the chief's head, then that's a problem. And it leads to an unequal application of and an unequal understanding of what the standards are. And when you have law enforcement who are the only people in the country that have the ability to seize, detain, and use deadly force, unclear of what the rules are, that's a problem.
And last I had heard, the officers involved in the Juwan Dallas case were put back on the streets. They're back out on patrol. But if you found them to be an excessive force, why wouldn't they be facing charges like anybody else?
Juwan Dallas.
The Juwan Dallas case, the officers involved in
Yeah,
that.
so you might recall I said that when there was an appropriate use of force, that the use of force in that situation was justifiable, but the treatment of Mr. Dallas after he was in custody was greatly concerning.
And what about the officers who were found to be excessive use of force? Would they be facing assault charges as in the Excel Academy case, or could there be any sort of criminal charges against them?
Well, I think that's more of an NPD determination about their the application of their general orders and memorandum orders and how they would treat that circumstance. And I don't mean to say that might on occasion be some mitigation of facts if an officer is fighting for his life with someone. If you let out a profanity, I think everyone understands that. So that's not what we're talking about. But we're talking about the use of profanity in situations where you don't have to use it.
Just to tail off of Brendan's question, we were speaking about the chief kind of being unaware of certain policies within the department. Would you say that the removal of the chief based off the things that you've seen and recommended, is an appropriate action for the city to take?
Well, I'll put it in this context. So if we're talking about general DOJ compliance standards in a corporate context, corporations have compliance programs they have to put in place. And if they don't put those compliance programs in place and something goes wrong, DOJ comes down very hard on those corporations. But if you have a compliance program in place and you try to catch fraud, waste, and abuse, and there's a system for reporting that and improving it, then if something goes wrong, DOJ doesn't drop the hammer on you. But one of the factors they consider in that circumstance, as well as the monitorship program that has been implemented in other cities where the police department has been engaging in a range of unacceptable conduct and unconstitutional conduct, is if you're serious about a change in the stewardship of your police department and you put the same person in place, how deep is your commitment to actually making the changes? So I think if you're asking if there's an outside view of whether or not a change should be made of the chief of police, if I'm looking at it from this perspective of DOJ, absolutely, a change should be made. There are numerous constitutional violations that I've cited here today, including the beating of a handcuffed individual suspect, the going into or the attempt to go into phones unconstitutionally repeatedly, the denigration of suspects who have had to have the use of force, deadly use of force, used against them at press conferences, the illegal and unconstitutional detention and transportation of family members of a decedent without probable cause. So that just is a litany of factors that I see that an outside entity like DOJ would be very interested in. And the part there is that if DOJ comes in and they implement a monitorship, then the city loses control of its police department. You have to change any policy, procedures, practices through the monitoring team. You have to get the approval of a federal judge to do it, and you get the pleasure of paying about $10 million a year for having that monitoring team in the city of Mobile monitoring your police department. So I commend the city, the administration, as well as the city council for conducting a study like this to show and demonstrate that the city of Mobile can be insightful about its Mobile Police Department and move it forward in the right direction without the intervention of an entity like DOJ and the public expense that that would cost.
Where does the Mobile Police Department stand in comparison to other police departments that you've looked into?
Well, I'm actually going to defer to my colleague here to talk about that. I have an opinion, but I'm going to let my colleague opine about that.
Well, I'm not want to rank the Mobile Police Department in terms of that, but I do know the culture, the practices, the things that we were able to investigate are the things that lead to police agencies leading to some horrific event. You don't want to get to a George Floyd event. You don't want to get to a Freddie Gray event. And the whole purpose of a review like this is to change the culture, the direction of a police department, not permanently, to change that in a permanent way. So the incidents that have occurred here, the things that we investigated and found are the kind of things that lead eventually to a DOJ consent decree in departments across the country. And I had the opportunity to review policies and practices and rewrite policies for a number of police departments in the United States and outside of the United States. And if you do not get a hold of these events, if you do not draw a bright yellow line and change the direction, that's where you're going to end up. And then people are going to ask the question, if you had all of these signs, symbols, and signals, why didn't you do something earlier so that you could change the police department? And I think, as Mr. Brown has said, constitutional policing and effective policing, dramatically reducing crime, are not mutually exclusive. In fact, policing was always supposed to be constitutional and always supposed to be impactful and effective. And I think that's what has to be done here.
Yeah, I also want to say there's not a police department in the United States that operates completely independent of an administration or a public safety director that is in supervision over them. They are an entity that in every city hierarchy is managed by the mayor's office. And it would appear to the outside investigative team that the autocratic style of Chief Prine bucks against that notion. And those who are critical of him, he tends to attack. And I will say that there was concern expressed that leading up to the no-knock vote at the city council, that if people were organized to come in that large force to a meeting like that, that could be seen as an attempt at intimidation. And if that intimidation is done in that venue, what is the average citizen going to experience? Someone who really doesn't have a voice. Or if the only voice they have, the only thing they can do to respond is curse and swear. And then if you curse and swear, and I want to point this out as well, officers go through training. And you might say that individual people in the street direct bad language toward them, and they can't help it, they're supposed to, they have to respond. Well, why do you pay them to go through training if they can't control their temper, their impulses? They need to be trained to reflexively react based upon the training, not based upon instinct, because that's why you pay them to be police officers and go to training. And so if the training isn't being implemented, if there aren't clear measures for this is the policy, it's to be adhered to at all times, there will be punishment for non-adherence, what you have is confusion and chaos. And people walking around with the ability to use the power of deadly force, that's dangerous.
Closing remarks, no more questions, yes. Sorry.
Last one, just a couple questions for the mayor.
I have a question for the mayor.
I think the mayor's gonna make some closing
I've
remarks.
got some comments, and then you can ask him. Slide this way. First, I'd like to begin by thanking Kenyen Brown and his team for coming in. You know, the report that we have received is I'm going to say not necessarily what we had hoped it would say, but what we were trying to do is find out what we needed to do to pivot from where we were so that we would not have that next incident, or the next incident that would maybe cause DOJ to come in here. And I think that what he's done is he has given us his thoughts, his observations, and knowing that the police department has not really had time to absorb it, I would say that there'll be some things that they do not agree with or they'll take issue with, which I think is fine. I think that can be expected. I'd say that there's some things, Mr. Brown, that the mayor and some of the others, you know, we would say, you know, that we probably have a difference of opinion also. But the bottom line is this, is we want a safer city. We want the citizens to feel safer. And in questioning Mr. Brown and his team earlier about responding to this report, you know, getting a third party to come in and help bring us together. If I heard it right, they said, no, we think that under the leadership of an executive director, public safety executive director, Rob Lasky, and the team that you have in place, that I think that you can develop a plan that would insulate you from these future incidents and the possibility of DOJ coming in. Am I?
That's correct.
Okay, which I think is paramount. I mean, because what he said is, as shocking as some of this may be, there is this belief that we can internally, without having to go outside and get a bunch of people involved, that we can fix this problem. The other comment I would make is that in some of the situations, that the PD, and having seen just a little bit of this and talked to them just for a few moments for the command staff, is that they have some examples of things that they're already doing and have been doing to address some of these issues that they know are problematic. So also that there are things that they know that they can do, but they will be working on, once they get the report and they analyze it, no matter how much they may disagree with it, they want Mobile to be a safer city. They like their jobs. This is a calling for them, and they want to make sure that they can do the very best. So this is maybe like going to your heart doctor, and all of a sudden, they've told you that you need to do these things differently, or you're going to have a heart attack. I believe, and I have 100% confidence, that the men and women that we have in the police department will move forward in the right manner. There's no question in their mind, after having talked with them, they know that the mayor is behind them, okay? And as Mr. Brown said, the mayor of the city is ultimately responsible for this. I've never shunned that responsibility. That is why we have taken the action that we've taken. First, to make sure that we had somebody come in and assess where we are so that we need to know where we need to go. If leadership is the problem, we will change leadership. And so we will do those things necessary to make sure that we fulfill our obligation of making Mobile a safer city. So.
And Mayor, if you've noticed these issues arising with Chief Byrne, I think you probably stated a year, 2 years ago, why wasn't it addressed sooner? Why did it take for us to get to where we are now for this to all come to light?
So, a couple of things is that when you appoint someone a chief, no matter if it's even a fire chief, or you appoint someone as the public safety director, finance director, the intent is for them to succeed. Okay? And so when you find out that maybe they're doing something that they need to do differently in order to make them succeed, what we've done in the past is try to make sure that we are giving them the tools, the training, the coaching, to get on a pathway to success. And also in trying to look at making a change in the police department. That is a monumental change. The mayor by himself cannot make that change. It takes the concurrence of the city council. Also, you have to look at, who's going to replace that chief. And so when you factor all of that in, look at the timeline of this administration, we made the decision that we wanted to do everything we could to assist Chief Prine in getting and being successful. We got to a point where we realized there were some irreconcilable differences, and that is ultimately why we made the decision to change. And it's not any different than having a divorce where the husband is 100% right that he's right, and the wife is 100% right, she's right, okay? But it doesn't matter, okay? What we want to do is we want to take the information that's been presented to us and let the police department work, and it won't be just in a vacuum. There'll be other eyes on this. We're not going to rely entirely on the police to police the police, okay? But we will get it right going forward.
Okay, guys, I'm gonna cut everybody off right there.
Okay, thank y'all.
Thank you all.
Maybe it's a